So the publishers Puffin have rewritten vast amounts of Roald Dahl's classic books. Essentially, they've taken the red pen to this children's author, changed characters, words, anything that might be deemed offensive by so-called sensitivity readers. So we've learned, for instance, that Augustus Gloop from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is no longer going to be fat. Miss Trunchbull from Matilda is no longer described as female. And the Oompa Loompas are no longer titchy and tiny, and they're gender neutral for good measure as well. Inaya, what have you made of this rewrite?
I mean, it's just, frankly, it's crazy. It's absurd. It's so dull. I mean, sensitivity readers have such a corrosive and pernicious effect on the literary industry and freedom of speech, essentially. Rewriting not just amazing classic works that have had huge influence over society, but actually authors now that are trying to explore different characters as well, that they are having them completely rethought in the name of sensitivity readers, a complete attack on kind of artistic and literary freedom. And as you've just described, many of those descriptions are just frankly absurd. And it just shows you not just the echo chamber and the conformity in many of these circles, that they can't see that this is something that is totally out of touch with the majority of people. And I think it's been really interesting listening to the arguments that have been put forward. Oh, it's just a commercial venture. I mean, firstly, who is demanding this? Who is asking for this? So I just think it's yet another example. And it's a more kind of joking, trivial end. But we see on one end this happening, but then on the other end, what's happening with Salman Rushdie. And the fact that there's actually a much more bloody and dangerous culture of censorship. And I do see it as part of that same culture of just a hostility to ideas.
Well, there's more than one way to burn a book, as Ray Bradbury famously said. Tom, I was going to bring on Salman Rushdie, actually, because he has expressed his outrage at this censorship. He's a man who knows what it's like to be censored.
No, definitely. And I think that was why it was, again, such a brilliant intervention. I think there was a lot of people who were slightly caught off guard by this particular act of cultural vandalism. I mean, there was, as is always the case, there's an attempt to make some justifications for it. People wouldn't want to sound like the sort of person to get booked on GB News lift, bend over backwards to say, actually, maybe it's fine for these reasons. But even amongst those sorts of people, there was still a kind of, this is a bit crazy.
Yeah, they've gone a bit far this time.
They've gone a bit far. This is a bit mad. And because it is the first thing. I mean, not only are many of the examples ridiculous, as you sort of point out, not least because Roald Dahl is fated and enjoyed because of the fact that there's a darkness to his work. There's a kind of latent malice to many of his characters, not so latent many of the time. I think he once said that he try as he might, he can't stop his characters being horrendously nasty to each other.
Yeah,
and that's part of what the appeal was. That's something which I think children in particular, despite the sort of slightly kind of costed way we tend to approach them, do enjoy that flicker of the sort of darker side of literature. And that's something that he caters to very effectively. So on the one hand, it makes no sense. Like, why would you cleanse Roald Dahl of precisely what really made him so distinctive in the first place? The other thing that makes it that bit more sinister is that in what sense, when you're taking these works and changing them hundreds of times in many cases, in some cases grafting on entirely new sentences, getting rid of entire words, like fat has gone from all of the books, apparently. You just can't use that. There's a certain point at which this is no longer his work. It's got his name on it. If you want to buy a new edition of this book, you go to his publisher, this is what they'll sell you, but in a way it's not his. And that's something which has disquieted people and should, even if they haven't necessarily got the vocabulary to express it, or they're too scared of being seen as a culture warrior for raising concerns about it.
For standing up for free speech, basically. I mean, one of the things this has highlighted is the sort of broader phenomenon of the sensitivity reader. And obviously we can know what's been changed because we've all read the old versions. We know what they're like, and people have been able to make comparisons. But this screening is going on all the time, behind the scenes. We don't even know what is being cancelled before publication right now. I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, this case has obviously got a lot of attention, but a similar thing happened to the author Kate Clancy. Her work, and that caused a lot of controversy. And as I just mentioned, I just think that this is deeply anti-democratic. Many of oftentimes the language that is used at things they're not even using every day.
Yeah.
And I just think it's really sad. I think it's really unfortunate that this is happening, and so few people, despite the fact that there has been more disquiet over this, still there isn't that systematic pushback in the publishing industry as the guardians of literature to actually call this out.
Yeah, that's the other scary thing, isn't it? It's from within the publishing industry. The barbarians are in the gates, I think is how you described it earlier this week.
This review was initiated by the Roald Dahl Story Company themselves. Whilst it was still in the possession of the Dahl family, they've since sold it to Netflix, essentially. And it's something which this is all just part of the kind of the common sense of that particular industry.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult to grapple with. This isn't about, in what sense can you kind of push back against that if this is just what everyone within that particular world thinks is entirely acceptable? But it obviously flows from a general sort of elite consensus, which is incredibly myopically preoccupied with the way in which words and culture warp people, as far as they can tell.
Particularly children.
But it was interesting because we often talk about how we live in an infantilized culture in which adults are treated like children. The flip side of that seems to be that children are treated like kind of robots, essentially. Is that you have to program them with the right messages at the right age. Otherwise, you don't know what kind of prejudices could curdle in their little brains. So you see this kind of preoccupation with children's literature in the form of this Roald Dahl story. And the sort of more absurd flip side of it is these new books that are written for no other reason than propaganda, effectively. Anti-racist baby, my first book of protest, feminist baby, and all this kind of other stuff.
This little Ruth Bader Ginsburg colouring books or whatever.
What's interesting, it's ridiculous. And it is dragging art and culture closer towards propaganda. That's the kind of the underlying message so much of this stuff, is that everything has to be put to work, has to say the right thing, impart the right message. But I'm also convinced it is very likely to repel children away from art and culture and literature, because it's precisely that ability to explore in some cases the slightly more dark things, the slightly more imaginative things, that actually makes it work. And when you've got a situation like in one of these edits, like in The Witches, where they've decided that they can't, where they were originally posing as cashiers in the supermarket, they have to be actually posing in plain sight as top scientists and businesswomen. You just think this is denigrating art and creativity to such an extreme extent. You even have to have like girl boss messages encoded in this. Then we've kind of lost we've kind of just sort of lost the game in that sense.
Yeah, and it's just so bad. It's just so on the nose a lot of the time. And actually, we have seen it not just in the literature world, but also in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So many remakes have been girl boss characters and men talking about how patriarchal they are. And actually, it just completely turns off the fans.
Yeah.
And actually, oftentimes when the fans no longer watch it and complain, and they're told that they're
racist.
Exactly, and bigoted. So you kind of just think, well, what more can you do if even just people reacting against it doesn't seem to make the kinds of impacts because it's just so entrenched.